All right, just going to do a quick microphone check. 1, 2, everything looks good. And we're back. All right, if you need any details are in the description box. This is just a read-along. The opinions based on the articles are mine alone. Feel free to share comments or your own opinions, and we can carry on a conversation if necessary. If not, I'll just move along. And these are my analysis on the articles provided today. All right, first article for today will be, will Israel start a regional war? Written by Walter Smolaric. Seems like this one was released April 15th on 2024. All right, the photo is by Ali Khamenei. The photo description is Ali Khamenei leads the funeral prayer for soldiers killed in the April 1st Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Credit Wikipedia. Dramatic developments over the weekend have left people around the world asking themselves, will there be a regional war in the Middle East? Right now, the top leaders of the Israeli government and military are debating whether or not to launch a major attack on Iran. This comes after Iran's retaliatory strike on Saturday night that saw a wave of drones and missiles target military facilities inside of Israel. The idea that Iran is the aggressor in this situation is an absurd reversal of reality. The strike was carried out in response to a brazen act of war on April 1st when Israel bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria, and assassinated a top Iranian military leader along with over a dozen others. Under international law, an embassy is considered the sovereign territory of the country that operates it. So this was effectively Israel bombing Iran itself. Iran had every legal and moral right to respond and acted like any other country would in the same situation. It is, of course, impossible to predict what comes next, but for people who oppose Israel's genocide in Gaza or simply do not want to see a devastating regional war break out, it is important to understand the different players and the considerations that are guiding their actions. Israel. The Israeli regime has not been able to achieve their stated war objectives, destroying the Palestinian resistance in Gaza and returning Israeli prisoners. Major internal pressures is mounting on Netanyahu as mass demonstrations denounce his government for its failure to make a deal for the prisoners' release, and opinion polls show the opposition would decisively win a new election. And Israel's most important international alliance with the United States is under unprecedented strain as public opinion rapidly shifts in favor of Palestine, causing an electoral crisis for Joe Biden. Under these circumstances, there is a logic for escalation. The longer the war lasts, the longer Netanyahu stays prime minister. If the war ends, an election is all but guaranteed, and Netanyahu is highly likely to lose power and face a number of criminal corruption trials. A regional war could allow him to redefine victory and gain more time for the far-right alliance he leads to regain their popularity. If a regional war breaks out, the United States would find it very difficult to stay out. The U.S. empire is locked in a long-term battle with an Iran-led bloc referred to as the Axis of Resistance, which opposes U.S. attempts to dominate the Middle East. In an all-out showdown between Israel and the Axis of Resistance, parentheses, which includes part of the Palestinian resistance, end parentheses, the Biden administration could calculate that a resistance victory would be so devastating to the standing of its empire in the region that they would feel compelled to more directly join in the fighting. However, there's another current inside the Israeli ruling establishment that argues against an escalation at this moment. The logic goes something like this. We have been profoundly isolated internationally since the genocide in Gaza began, even among our traditional allies. This is our chance to regain global support by posing as the victims of Iranian aggression and soliciting aid on that basis. Since the major Western powers don't want a regional war, they will offer us concessions in return for not launching another strike on Iran. So let us focus on securing things like new sanctions on Iran, the designation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps as a terrorist organization, and most importantly, a new $14 billion round of military aid from the United States. One other important factor is at play here: fascist parties in the ruling coalition. Netanyahu depends on the support of two fascist parties for his majority in parliament, and they are threatening to leave the coalition if Netanyahu, quote, softens, end quote, his position on continuing the war until, quote, final victory, end quote. If this happens, snap elections would take place where Netanyahu's defeat is highly likely. Iran. Defending the nation's sovereign territory is a paramount responsibility for any government, as is protecting the nation's leadership from assassination. Turning the other cheek was simply not an option considering how extreme the Israeli aggression was on April 1. Iran had to send a message that it was capable of willing to defend itself. Failure to do so would just invite more Israeli attacks. At the same time, it was not lost on the Iranian government that an escalation is exactly what a faction of the Israeli government is seeking. Iran did not want to inadvertently give Netanyahu what he wanted and subject its population to the devastation of all-out war in the process. The response needed to be carefully calibrated so that it demonstrated Iran's resolve but did not immediately spark a regional war. This is a similar tightrope to the one the Iranian government had to navigate in 2020 after the Trump administration assassinated top general Qasem Soleimani. Iran's retaliation showcased the technological capacity that the country has gone to great lengths to develop in recent years. No other military operation in world history has involved this many drones, and Iran's arsenal of advanced missiles is a key deterrent capable of striking back not only at Israel, but also the ring of Pentagon bases surrounding the country, which Iran said would be targeted if the U.S. joined in a subsequent Israeli attack. The strike had the effect of piercing the illusion inside Israel that they were immune from substantial retaliation and raising the spirits of Palestinians who are in desperate need of support from the rest of the world. It also forced Israel and the U.S. to reveal valuable information about how their missile defense systems operate. While a formidable set of weapons were used in Iran's retaliation, it was not a surprise attack. It was launched nearly 2 weeks after the embassy bombing, and Iran claims to have given regional governments a 72-hour notice that the counterattack was coming. On the night of the retaliation, Iran announced that waves of drones were on their way hours before they arrived in Israel. This could be interpreted as indicating Iran's desire to avoid doing any major damage that would play into Israel's hands by providing a justification for a regional war. United States. The U.S. government has one fundamental goal guiding its actions on the world stage: ensure the domination of Wall Street and the Pentagon over the entire globe. For this reason, Israel is considered an invaluable tool for U.S. empire. Over the decades, it has proven the most reliable and aggressive opponent of any progressive and anti-imperialist movement in the Middle East. Israel is effectively one big U.S. base in the heart of the region. That's why State Department spokesman Matthew Miller on Monday said U.S. support for Israel is, quote, is sacrosanct, end quote. In a high-stakes direct confrontation between Israel and Iran, the U.S. government would want to avoid an Iranian victory at all costs. Iran has been a top target for regime change oil going all the way back to the 1979 revolution, which disposed the country's dictatorial U.S.-backed monarchy. If Iran and its allies in the axis of resistance prevailed in such a conflict over Israel, then it would be a historic defeat not only for the Israeli regime, but also a massive blow to U.S. imperialism in the region that Washington may not be able to recover from. At the same time, the mass movement in solidarity with Palestine has caused a profound political crisis in the immediate sense for the Biden administration. The enormous outpouring of support week after week in cities and towns nationwide, the massive movement to vote, quote, uncommitted, end quote, in the Democratic primaries, and constant civil disobedience actions shutting down business as usual have piled tremendous pressure on Biden. Everyone recognizes that Biden's support for genocide in Gaza could cost him re-election. These short-term electoral interests are colliding with the long-term interests of U.S. empire, and the ultimate outcome is, of course, uncertain. If the movement can step up this pressure, the discord within the U.S.-Israeli camp will intensify in a way that is favorable to the Palestinian struggle. The U.S. military shot down dozens of the drones and missiles involved in the Iranian counterattack, and junior U.S. partners Britain and France contributed as well. In this sense, they came to the aid of their key asset in the region, the Israeli apartheid regime, against their main enemy, Iran. The Biden administration then claimed this is a remarkable military victory, with the implication being that no further, quote, retaliation, end quote, would be necessary from Israel. The Biden administration also said that it would not be part of any such, quote, retaliatory, end quote, strike should Israel choose to carry it out. A regional war would be utterly devastating to the people of the Middle East. If Israel succeeds in provoking one, the death, suffering, and destruction would be massive. There is only one way to remove the threat of such war breaking out: end the genocide in Gaza. As long as Israel's killing spree against Palestinians continues, the fighting could escalate uncontrollably at the moment's notice. Anyone interested in peace should stand with the Palestinian people, demand an end to all U.S. aid to Israel, and the end of the occupation once and for all. All right, so that's a really interesting article. Most of it here makes sense. It's factual to me. My only disagreement with it is in the end paragraph, talking about peace. So it's almost like they, like when we talk about peace in the Middle East or peace in Gaza, we're talking about just returning things to the way they were, which is pretty much just a slow brew occupation of Israel on Gaza. I'm pretty sure that's not what this article is going for. But my personal honest opinion is that there will never be peace in the Middle East as long as Israel is there with their Zionist agenda, because they are always going to try to dominate the region one way or another, whether it's taking over Gaza or taking over Lebanon. Eventually, they're going to try to spread and conquer. They're going to try the old manifest destiny kind of might is right kind of scenario or position, right? I think what we should always be unapologetically be asking for is a one-state solution, where there is no longer Israel. That sounds perhaps triggering to some people, but no, that is what peace is. That is what democracy is. The Palestinian people and the people in Israel actually having elections and choosing people to actually govern. Real democracy would be more in detailed. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't see a peaceful way out of this in any way, because Israel is always going to be backed by the U.S. So any kind of war is going to trigger a wide regional war. But what other choice is the empire giving the people or the region, right? So it's going to turn into a Vietnam or something like that, where the people are going to have to fight, unfortunately, or they're just going to die silently. Unfortunately, I think this is what they're going for. This is obviously what Netanyahu's going for. He wants them. It's a win-win for him, whether they die silently or die fighting, right? If they die silently and quietly in the night, he gets to take over the land and become a billionaire. If they are defended by the axis of resistance, then he knows the U.S. will come in and help them out. And that's unfortunately what the empire does. It's very ghoulish. But they're the Palestinian people and the axis of resistance really are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think they have to play their cards right and actually show their strength in set a line in the sand. Because right now, any line that is in the sand keeps getting moved further and further back. And people paying the price already are the Palestinians. They're already dying. They're dying peacefully. So yeah, I think the axis of resistance hopefully steps it up and actually puts a solid line in the sand. And I hope that solid line in the sand is a one-state solution. And that's the most I can say for this article. The article is very detailed, and I think it's self-explanatory. That's just my add-on analysis to it. Give me a second. I'm going to move on to the next article. What Israel started regional war. Yeah, I think that's what Israel wants. It's definitely what Netanyahu wants. Okay, there's an article here called "The CIA Overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah and the Struggle Against Neocolonialism in West Africa Today." All right, this is an article by Joe Tash, April 17th, 2024. The photo is of Kwame Nkrumah meets with President John F. Kennedy in 1961. Credit Wikipedia. One day after his inauguration, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, Senegal's new self-proclaimed, quote, left pan-Africanist, end quote, president, announced that the new government will conduct an audit on the country's oil, gas, and mining sectors. Faye said, quote, the exploitation of our natural resources, which according to the Constitution belong to the people, will receive particular attention from my government, end quote, and stated that Senegal's existing contracts with energy corporations like BP will be renegotiated if needed. Faye's campaign victory is another contribution to a recent trend in West Africa in which several new governments have formed on the basis of political and economic sovereignty, rejecting the neocolonial domination that has reigned on the continent since the mid-20th century. One of these countries, Niger, recently ordered all U.S. troops to leave its territory. These developments have caused much consternation for U.S. imperialism. U.S. government and military officials have openly discussed the strategic importance of Africa to the United States, and they are debating how to retain maximum control over the continent. We can look to the case of Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president and prime minister, to understand some of the ways U.S. imperialism may potentially respond to the current development in West Africa, and how those of us in the United States can better equip ourselves to challenge it. Kwame Nkrumah, an architect of Pan-Africanism. Ghana was colonized by Britain in 1874 and was called the, quote, Gold Coast Colony, end quote, during this period. Its national liberation movement picked up steam in the late 1940s, and Kwame Nkrumah rose as a leader in two of the colony's most significant political parties. First, the United Gold Coast Convention, and later the convention's People's Party. Recognizing that independence was inevitable, Britain attempted to tightly control the process of independence. The colonial governor organized elections after imprisoning the most militant leaders of the national liberation movement. Ruma, and many other CPP cadres in 1950. Despite these obstacles, the CPP dominated the election and landed a decisive blow against Britain's colonialism. In 1957, Ghana became one of the first countries in Africa to win its independence, and Ruma was elected first as prime minister, then later as president. Ruma was Pan-Africanist and a socialist who initiated projects to advance the political and economic independence of Africa at a time when most of the continent was still colonized. In 1958, Rama convened a meeting between leaders of the 8 independent African states at the time. That meeting was soon followed by the first All-African Peoples Conference held in Accra, Ghana, that same year. The main goal of the conference was to build unity among the 300 delegates about the path forward for the struggle against colonialism and imperialism on the continent. 5 years later, in 1963, Ruma claimed a central role in establishing the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, initially consisted of 32 countries and had 5 stated purposes. 1. To promote the unity and solidarity of the African states. 2. To coordinate and intensify their cooperation and efforts to achieve a better life for the people of Africa. 3. To defend their sovereignty, their territorial integrity and independence. 4. To eradicate all forms of colonialism from Africa. And 5. To promote international cooperation, having due regard to the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Rama also made immense contributions to the struggle against imperialism by identifying and defining, quote, neocolonialism, end quote. In 1965, his book, quote, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, end quote, Rama writes, once a territory has become nominally independent, it is no longer possible, as it was in the last century, to reverse the process. Existing colonies may linger on, but now new colonies will be created. In place of colonialism as the main instrument of imperialism, we have today neocolonialism. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside. Rama identified that as the era of formal colonialism was coming to an end, the imperialists were using financial domination as a means to retain political control over much of the global south. This later came to fruition in Rama's own country. Because of his commitment to socialism and Pan-Africanism, openness to collaboration with the Soviet Union and China, and contributions to anti-imperialist consciousness throughout Africa and the world, Rama was increasingly viewed as a threat by the U.S. government, who set into motion a plan to remove him from office. CIA-backed coup and socialist experiment in Ghana. In December 1957, just 9 months after Rama was elected to lead an independent Ghana, the CIA distributed a now declassified report titled, quote, The Outlook for Ghana, end quote, to the White House, National Security Council, and several other federal agencies. The report identified that Rama's priorities of rapidly modernizing Ghana's economy and advancing Pan-Africanism on the continent would be hampered by a lack of financial resources in the newly independent country. The conclusion of the report set a general framework that informed U.S. policy towards Rama and Ghana. Attitudes and policies towards the U.S. will probably be shaped largely by economic interest. A growing number of Ghanaians have visited the U.S., where they have been particularly impressed by technical achievements, but repelled by the racial discrimination which they encountered. Both on the latter count and because of the extremes in which anti-colonialism is expressed, Ghana does not find moderate U.S. policies very appealing. Ghana, nevertheless, is favorably disposed towards the U.S. at present, especially since it is regarded as a logical source of the foreign capital and technical assistance essential for the Volta project, and Ghana is likely to make larger requests for aid in the near future. We believe that Ghana's desire to avoid close alignment with any great power and to act independently in African affairs will limit both Soviet and Western influence in at least the short run. However, the practice of the socialist bloc, taking positions on colonial and racial matters similar to those of the former colonies, will often result in Ghana's lining up with the bloc on certain issues before the UN. The relationships are likely to develop regardless of any countering Western actions. The Volta project was the cornerstone of Ruma's vision to modernize Ghana's economy. It was a hydroelectric dam that would generate enough electricity to scale up industrial production in Ghana, particularly of aluminum, which is an abundant natural resource in Ghana. As alluded to the CIA's report, the US government decided to fund the Volta project in an attempt to prevent Ghana from fully aligning with the socialist camp and to provide imperialism with some leverage over the country. However, as the CIA predicted, even US support for the Volta project could not prevent the relationship with Ghana from fraying due to Ruma's fundamental opposition to colonialism and imperialism. As the relationship deteriorated, the US government began taking steps to have Ruma overthrown. In 1964, the US State Department Director's Office of Western African Affairs, Mahoney Trimble, proposed an quote, action program, end quote, for U.S. policy in Ghana. In it, he openly stated, quote, U.S. pressure, if appropriately applied, could induce a chain reaction eventually leading to Ruma's downfall, end quote. Key components of the action program were a slowdown of withdrawal of payments for the Volta project, quote, psychological warfare, end quote, to diminish support for Ruma within Ghana and turning leaders of other African countries against Ruma. The United States also began building ties with the forces within Ghana, who eventually successfully led a coup against Ruma in February 1966. In a 1965 international memorandum, Robert Comer of the National Security Council wrote, quote, FYI, we may have a pro-Western coup in Ghana soon. Certain key military and political figures have been planning one for some time, and Ghana's deteriorating economic condition may provide the spark, end quote. Quote, the plotters are keeping us briefed. The state thinks we're more on the inside than the British, end quote. The memo continued, quote, while we are not directly involved, parentheses, I'm told, end parentheses, we and other Western countries, parentheses, including France, end parentheses, have been helping to set up the situation by ignoring Ruma's pleas for economic aid, end quote. There is also compelling evidence that the CIA was directly involved in the coup. In 1978, quote, first-hand intelligence sources, end quote, told the New York Times that the CIA advised and supported the coup plotters. The New York Times article also acknowledges that this claim is supported by, quote, In Search of Enemies, end quote, a book written by John Stockwell, who worked for the CIA for 12 years. After the coup, the U.S. government rushed to provide financial and diplomatic support for the coup government to ensure that Ruma and the CPP could not regain power. This included the delivery of 500 tons of milk to alleviate the hardship that the U.S. had been helping foment only months before. The struggle against neocolonialism continues. It is not difficult to see some parallels between Ruma's vision for Africa and those expressed by today's new crop of African leaders who reject neocolonialism. Those of us in the United States must study the history of U.S. intervention in Ghana and all of Africa so that we can better oppose the attacks that are likely to come in the future. This history illustrates that U.S. imperialism will use a hybrid strategy of economics, information, political, and, if needed, military warfare to prevent the rise of sovereign African countries. However, as the position of U.S. imperialism slips in the world, anti-imperialist consciousness continues to develop within the United States, and more countries join the ranks of those who refuse to submit to colonial domination any longer. These tried and true tractions of neocolonialism are set to face their toughest tests yet. Okay, so this brings to mind BRICS for me, which the only imperialists aren't the U.S., I don't claim to understand everything about BRICS, but BRICS is a way of creating balance at the moment by taking power away from the biggest Western imperialist powers, right? And yeah, I support it because I think what Western imperialism has done is made everybody here in America quite comfortable at the expense of everybody else around the world. Uh, this is not to negate that there is also a lot of poverty and wealth disparity here in America, but it's just an example of how decrepit the system is. That even with all of the oppression that America uses on other nations and countries, we still do not redistribute the wealth here equally or properly. We just let oligarchs hoard it all. So it's a horrible system that does not work. It does not work for the health of humanity overall. It's not holistic. Um, so I do hope the best for Africa. I do hope that they prevail, just like I do have hopes for Venezuela to prevail. I hope they can get back on their feet, just like I have hopes for Cuba to prevail. And we should, as human beings, show working class solidarity with all these people around the world that are suffering due to Western empire siphoning their resources, exploiting the labor and the resources in other countries just so we can live comfortably here. And it doesn't have to be that way. We could all live comfortably with all the technology and the resources available these days. So these are my thoughts on this article. I think it was a strong article full of a lot of knowledge, especially historical knowledge on Ruma's history. And I think, yeah, neocolonialism. It's a lot harder for them to get away with that now with the age of the internet. I think as long as we have independent journalists out there informing, and as long as we have governments that are really trying to move forward, being open and truthful, showing the evidence, then yeah, the truth will set most people free, right, in one way or another. But that's not to say that things won't get violent. They always get violent because the last resort, they'll always at the end resort to violence if any other, yeah, Western Empire will resort to violence if it cannot control by any other means. And that's not just not abroad, that's here at home too. That's why we see police abusing of protesters, police abusing of labor workers, as well as the corporations abusing of labor workers. And it's historic. Every time, even here, every time workers have tried to unionize, it's always been the police to come and to defend the corporations and beat down and even shoot and kill workers. This is historic. This is the truth. So they are set up to defend property and defend the elite. That is what they're designed to do. They are not designed to protect you, the working class, as much as you'd want to believe that. The history and the facts are totally against that. Okay, so this is my analysis on this. Great article again. These articles are so informative and so detailed that generally I don't have much else to add to them, except what comes to my mind in regards to the message and what it's trying to push out in summary. All right, let's see here. Let me check how U.S. helped Israel. All right. Just going to check the audio again. Check. All right, audio still good. Okay. Let me get another sip of tea. How the U.S. helped Israel promote the Hamas mass rape lie to justify mass murder in Gaza by Joyce Shadiak, April 19th, 2024. So this is pretty recent, just 2 days ago. It's a bit of a longer read. I'll try to focus on the details on this one. I think this is a real important one because it definitely is a mask-off moment for Israel and U.S. We are all Palestinian women. Yes, I agree. International Working Women's Day, the New York City Liberation News photo, why it soars. All right. Rape is a terrible crime. It can never be justified or defended. The natural inclination is to abhor rape and those who commit it. However, because it is such a charged issue, false rape accusations, while in general rare, have been used time and time again to whip up hatred against oppressed people. This has been seen in the United States with the myth of the, quote, black rapist, end quote, which launched countless lynch mobs. Today, the claim, quote, Hamas committed mass rape over Israeli women on October 7th as a weapon of war, end quote, is another example. This claim has been shown to have no basis in fact. Instead, it's an Israeli government propaganda campaign meant to manipulate public opinion in the West to justify genocide in Gaza. To this day, no rape victims from October 7th have stepped forth. There is no forensic evidence. The sensationalized, quote, eyewitness accounts, end quote, of, quote, horrific sexual assaults, end quote, have been thoroughly debunked and discredited by the independent news outlets. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu even openly said the rape stories helped legitimize and extend Israel's mass murder in Gaza. Yet to this day, U.S. politicians and the corporate media regularly preface Gaza reports by mentioning, quote, horrific atrocities, end quote, allegedly committed by Hamas. U.S. promoted mass rape fraud. This is because U.S. politicians and the establishment media are an integral part of this deception. The Biden administration, members of Congress, and the mainstream media repeat the mass rape lie at every turn. A U.S. newspaper and a UN official have used their prestige to keep the rape story going after it had fallen apart by repackaged and debunked Israeli atrocity stories and claiming independent investigation, end quote, found, quote, new evidence, end quote. This shameful exploitation of people's horrors at this crime that is committed mostly against women is meant to cover up the horror of genocide, where Palestinian women and children are the main victims. Some 70% of those killed are women and children. Women and children have been arbitrarily executed. With starvation used as a weapon of war, women are the last to eat and the children the first to die. A Palestinian child is killed in Gaza every 10 minutes. 2 mothers are killed every hour. Of the 1.9 million displaced, close to 1 million are women and girls. Hamas and other groups in the Palestinian armed resistance have roundly denounced as, quote, slander, end quote, the charge that they ordered fighters to rape women. They also point out that individual acts of sexual assault may have occurred as others came through the fence later on October 7th who were not under their discipline. Rape lie used to justify destruction of Libya. In November of 2023, many Palestinian women's groups with Historic Palestine and in exile came together and declared ending the Gaza genocide a feminist issue. They made an urgent call to all those truly interested in women's rights to join the feminists worldwide and others fighting for a ceasefire, to end the blockade, and to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza unimpeded. Israel's answer was a PR event at the UN on December 4, 2023, that excoriated women's and feminist groups that backed a ceasefire, claiming they were indifferent to the suffering of Israeli women because they did not condemn, quote, Hamas rapes, end quote. Among the speaker was Hillary Clinton. Clinton has been especially helpful in propagating the, quote, mass rape, end quote, falsehood under the guise of supporting, quote, women's rights, end quote. She knows the drill. When she was Secretary of State, her department fabricated a later debunked story that Libyan leader Gaddafi gave his troops Viagra to rape rebels. This racist falsehood was used to justify NATO's carpet bombing and total destruction of Libya. No hashtag #MeToo for Palestinian women. quote, believe women, end quote, these pro-Israeli propagandists said, hijacking for settler colonialism the words of the, quote, Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too movement, only there were no women to believe. To this day, no Israeli women have stepped forth to say they were raped by a Palestinian fighter on October 7th, and contrary to the U.S. congressional resolution saying there were thousands of women raped, not one, quote, eyewitness testimony, end quote, has withstood scrutiny. Meanwhile, the women who should be believed are instead ignored by the media and by politicians who do not speak out on their behalf. They are the many Palestinian women who have come forward with credible witnesses to testify to rape and sexual assault at the hands of Israeli soldiers in Gaza and in Israeli detention. For example, to this date, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has ignored for months recommendations from his own staff to suspend aid to Israel military and police units accused of abusing Palestinians, including interrogators accused of raping and torturing a teenager. While ignoring the plight of the Palestinian women, U.S. politicians loudly and often repeat debunked stories that resistance fighters committed mass rape. For example, in this March 7th State of the Union speech, President Joe Biden accused Hamas of, quote, massacre, end quote, and, quote, sexual violence, end quote, against 200, quote, women and girls, men and boys, end quote. The House and Representatives passed a resolution in February falsely claiming there were, quote, thousands of testimonies from eyewitnesses, end quote, of, quote, countless instances of rape, gang rape, sexual violence, end quote, by Hamas. Israel directs media to unreliable sources. The most horrific description of mass rape and other alleged atrocities against Israeli women and children on October 7th come from Zaka. The ultra-right religious group collects bodies and body parts from sites of, quote, unnatural, end quote, deaths and transports them to morgues. And its founder, Yehuda Meshi Sahav, attempted suicide after he was implicated in dozens of rapes and sexual assaults of teens, women, and children. Zakah's members have no professional training and are not qualified to make assessments about rape on the bodies they collected. Their testimonies have no details, no age, no location, and no time. There are no pictures or videos to back up their claims. The bodies they describe were buried quickly without examination for forensic evidence. All one has is their word. Zakah atrocity stories have even been debunked in the Israeli press. The source for the widely publicized beheaded babies, children tied together and burned, and children ripped from its mother's womb and other debunked atrocity stories is one Zaka official, Jossi Ladu. Recently, Ladu admitted that his claims of, quote, executed children, end quote, were a lie. Zaka volunteers are not credible, yet when the international media wants to know what happened on October 7th, the Israeli government press offices set up an interview with Zaka. Zaka testimony praised for giving Israel maneuvering room. The director of the Israeli press office, Nitzan Hain, called Zaka, quote, remarkable, valuable, and effective, end quote, and, quote, extremely important in Hasbara, end quote. Hasbara is the Israeli word for propaganda that justifies government actions, often portraying Israel as the victim. Netanyahu praised them for helping to legitimize and extend Israel's war on Gaza. He told Zaka, quote, we need to buy time by turning the world leaders and to public opinion. You have an important role in influencing public opinion, which also influences leaders. We are in a war. It will continue. The war is not only to take care of the 1,400 people, but also to give us the maneuvering room, end quote. Relative says New York Times invented the rape of a victim. Independent media, including the Electronic Intifada and Mandawi's, along with The Intercept, have written many articles thoroughly exposing the alleged, quote, eyewitness to the rape, end quote, on October 7th as unreliable, debunking their atrocity stories, and revealing their links to the Israeli government. This information has been widely circulated on social media. However, CNN, the BBC, and New York Times, and other major medias have ignored these exposes, choosing to report as fact whatever the Israel government presents. No U.S. media outlet has come to Israel's rescue more than the New York Times. On December 28th, it showcased an article headline, quote, "Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th," end quote. Claiming to have done its own investigation, the Times found, quote, "new details," end quote, that Hamas, quote, "weaponized rape and sexual violence against Israeli women on October 7th," end quote. The Times is a major influencer of the 24-hour cycle, often determining what and how issues are covered by the other major news outlets like BBC, The Washington Post, and CNN. But the article began to unravel the very next day when the family of an alleged rape victim said the Times interviewed them under false pretenses. About a third of the Times article covers the alleged rape of Gal Abdouche, who the Times called, quote, "the woman in the black dress," end quote. On December 29th, Eddie Baraka, Abdouche's mother, said that the family knew nothing about the sexual assault issue until the piece was published. Nassim Abdouche, Gal's brother-in-law, said his brother's wife was not raped and that, quote, "the media invented it," end quote. Abdouche's sister, Miral Alter, said, "The Times reporters, quote, mentioned they want to write a report in memory of Gal. That's it. If we knew that the title would be about rape and butchery, we've never accepted that," end quote. Two teen sisters, the Times also said, were raped and murdered in the bedroom in Kibbutz Be'eri, were not raped either. Be'eri spokesperson Michael Pakin said, quote, "they were shot and were not subjected to sexual abuse," end quote. Experts call the Times investigation disgraceful. None of the media repeating Zaka atrocity stories has bothered to call in independent experts to examine these stories for veracity. MENA Rights Group, a legal advocacy NGO representing Middle East and North African victims of human rights violations, stepped forward to do just this after the Times article was published. MENA calls the Times investigation, quote, "disgraceful," end quote, in a statement signed by 16 organizations and 1,000 individuals from 50 countries. The statement cites lack of forensic evidence, no victim involvement or testimonies, and sensational testimonies that were not fact-checked. MENA denounced the Times for, quote, "its exploitation of women's bodies and struggles as a means to fabricate assault incidents and push propaganda for an unlawful occupation, thereby abetting the genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people," end quote. No major media has covered the MENA statement. Writer could find no rape victims. There is a backstory to this article. Anna Schwartz, who the Times hired to do most of the on-the-ground investigation, is an inexperienced writer with a pro-Israeli bias. She has served in Israeli Air Force intelligence, and on social media, she liked a tweet saying Israel needed to turn Gaza into a, quote, "slaughterhouse," end quote. In a January 20th interview with Israel's Channel 12, she explained that she tried to find rape victims by calling the 11 Israeli hospitals that examine and treat potential victims of sexual violence. Quote, "they told me, no complaint of sexual assault was received," end quote. She said, the manager of the sexual assault hotline in South Israel's told her they had no report of sexual violence either. She found no corroborating evidence at the alleged places of sexual attack. Schwartz said she then turned to Israeli officials, police, soldiers, and witnesses being managed by the Israeli government to write the article. Media interviews with the unnamed paramedic who falsely said he was, quote, "evidence," end quote. He saw, quote, "evidence," end quote, that two teenage girls had been raped at Kibbutz Be'eri were being handled by a spokesperson for the Israeli government, Eylon Levy. Schwartz spoke extensively with Saka members. Jassy Landau, originator of the debunked, quote, 40 beheaded babies, end quote, and, quote, pregnant women shot and stabbed with her stomach ripped open, end quote, fabrications, is featured in the Times article. UN report recycles debunked stories. When the Times articles lost credibility, a news source brought the, quote, mass rape, end quote, falsehood back to life. A March 5th report by Pramila Padden, UN Special Representative of Sexual Violence and Conflict, claimed that there are, quote, reasonable grounds, end quote, to believe Hamas had committed rapes on October 7th. The media spun the report as if it backed Israel's claims. But the report didn't support Israeli claims. Her report says it couldn't find one direct testimony of sexual assault on October 7th. It found, quote, no digital evidence specifically depicting acts of sexual violence, end quote. It was, quote, unable to establish the prevalence of sexual violence, end quote. It says a, quote, full-fledged investigation is needed, end quote, and notes that Israel won't permit UN agencies when an investigation mandate to make independent assessments. The report based its dubious conclusion on, quote, reasonable grounds, end quote, for Hamas rapes, not on evidence, but on information, quote, sourced from Israel national institutions, end quote. The Israeli military, the Internal Intelligence Agency, Shin Bet, and the Israeli National Police, the same forces committing genocide in Gaza, and Beir Patton was accompanied by Jossi Landu of Zaka. There is a backstory here as well. Far from being natural, in each meeting that she attended in the settlements near Gaza, quote, Patton consistently expressed her solidarity, empathy, and sympathy towards Israel, end quote. The Israeli newspaper Jedioth Avronoth reported. Patton's position, UN envoy on sexual violence and conflict, is an advisory, not investigation position that was created by Hillary Clinton in 2009. Patton has used this position to advance a pro-Western agenda before. In October 2022, she claimed that Russian soldiers were being supplied with Viagra to rape Ukrainian women. A month later, she admitted this was a fabrication. While Patton could not find one victim to interview, one Israeli former hostage has recently come forward to say she was sexually abused while she was held in Gaza. She is Amit Susanna, who was released from Gaza in a prison. Excuse me, let me start this over. While Patton could not find one victim to interview, one Israeli former hostage has recently come forward to say she was sexually abused while she was held in Gaza. She is Amit Susanna, who was released from Gaza in a prisoner exchange on November 30th after being held for 55 days. She said on March 26 in another detailed Times article that she was made to perform a sexual act at gunpoint while captive. Hamas, while skeptical, has offered to investigate the allegations, but said an inquiry was not possible in the current circumstances. Surely a ceasefire and an allegation of the suffering and an alleviation of the suffering Israel has inflicted on the Palestinians in Gaza and the reestablishment of government institutions there to conduct an inquiry would be a minimum prerequisite to any meaningful investigation of Susanna's claims. But Israel will not allow this and is, in fact, spinning hostage rape allegations to justify the continuation of the genocidal war that makes a meaningful investigation impossible. Politicians and media have discredited themselves. The Biden administration, elected officials, and the media have worked overtime to create and keep alive this racist trope. Certainly, it has had an effect, but at the same time, in the eyes of many, the media and the politicians that go along with and promote this false narrative have only discredited themselves. From college campuses to workplaces to churches to trade union halls, hundreds of groups and hundreds of thousands of individuals are taking to the streets to demand a ceasefire, many also demanding a free Palestine. Hundreds of thousands have voted, quote, uncommitted, end quote, in state Democratic primaries rather than endorse the U.S. president dubbed, quote, Genocide Joe, end quote. Activists are confronting politicians everywhere. These activists see fraudulent claims of mass rape as a loathsome U.S. and Israeli manufactured atrocity meant to detract from the real atrocities being committed against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. They detest this exploitation of women's oppression for imperialist ends. They are revolted at the phony feminism of the Hillary Clintons and sickened by blatant misuse of feminism by the Israeli and US governments as a tool to silence those who would speak out against a genocide in Gaza. These protesters are listening to the voice completely left out of the corporate media and ignored by the politicians, the Palestinian voice. They are inspired by the resilience of the Palestinian people, even when subjected to unspeakable atrocities. They note the overwhelming Palestinian support for their armed fighters as a legitimate and necessary part of the struggle against oppression and for national liberation. The feminists they believe are Palestinian. To this movement, quote, believe women, end quote, means believing the women of Palestine. The Palestinian Feminist Collective explains that a key component of Zionist settler colonialism is gender, sexual violence, and oppression. The PFC has asked all women's and feminist organizations to support Palestine liberation and to back it as a feminist issue because there is no real feminist for anyone without anti-imperialism. There is no real feminism for anyone without anti-imperialism. Yeah, so this article is a well-detailed article debunking all of the Israel propaganda. Is really detailed and correct. And to elaborate more on this end paragraph, when you make false accusations, you make it harder to believe those that are telling the truth, that really need the help. For instance, the Palestinian men and women and children in Gaza and in Palestine, they're abused by the IDF, by Israel officers, and by imperialist systems. And when it talks about feminism for anyone without anti-imperialism, what it's talking about is like there's liberal feminism, which is actually toxic, and then there's like proletariat feminism. Liberal feminism is when you have powerful women like Hillary Clinton bombing poor people around the world, enriching themselves. It's the girl power feminist that just wants to be the boss, get on top, and step on other people. You have proletariat feminism, where it's when women want all women empowered, all minorities empowered, for equality or equity, and for a true democracy. We can go more in depth about that issue, but there's actually great articles. One Dime has a great video on proletariat feminism. I would recommend looking up One Dime on YouTube and watching their proletariat feminism video essay, which is very detailed and explains in detail the whole issue of why liberal feminism is still not enough, and it's just another part of the capitalist tool to maintain the elites in power while still stepping on women in general. A small example is like when they use one woman in power to say all women are powerful because one made it, but then that's like saying all working class can be billionaires when that makes no dang sense. So the issue here is not to make everybody billionaires, but to make everybody, to provide everybody a good standard of living, along with rights. Okay. All right. So that's my opinion on that. Let's see here. Let's go back. I think there's one article left. These are long articles today, but let's see here. Here's a good one. Let me take another sip. I'll also check on my my audio here. Make sure my audio is good. Audio check. All good. All right. Take a sip. Another lengthy article. Awesome. What is Israel's military strategy and can it be defeated? by Jasper Saw, April 21st, 2024. That's today. The photos of IDF soldiers with a journalist. Israel is in a strategic bind. Iran's retaliation against Israel for bombing its embassy in Syria has only further confirmed what has been increasingly clear for months, that Israel has been strategically defeated. Some Israelis had even begun to admit this to themselves before Iran's retaliation. Opposition leader Yair Lapid declared that Iran's operation has, quote, shattered, end quote, Israel's deterrence. Over the last week, a wave of defeatist pro-Israel articles flooded the media in Israel and the United States. Led among them, Israeli newspaper Haaretz published a piece with a blunt headline, quote, saying what can't be said, Israel has been defeated, a total defeat, end quote. To casual observers of Israeli atrocities and to many Zionists around the world, the idea that one of the most well-equipped so-called advanced militaries in the world could be resoundingly, even totally defeated is a shocking proposition. Defeat in this context means that Israel is unable to achieve a single war aim by means of military pressure. The capacity of the Palestinian resistance factions in Gaza to fight has hardly been degraded, much less destroyed, as the Israeli aim to, quote, dismantling Hamas, end quote, implies. The prisoners taken on October 7th have only been released through negotiations. Hundreds of thousands of settlers have fled from the settlements inside the Gaza envelope and along the Lebanese border, many without plans to return. Iran's intervention revealed the weakness in Israel's air defense systems and reliance on the United States and US-backed Arab regimes to intercept the Iranian attack. The political and social crises within Israel are sharper than ever, and the balance of forces regionally is not in their favor, as covered recently in Liberation News. But defeat also means the logics and strategies that have governed Zionist hard power in Palestine for decades have been broken by the events of the last 6 months. How did we get to this point? How has the resistance achieved their war aims? What has been the Israeli strategy in pursuing this genocide, and what can historical precedents tell us about what might come next? 3 legs of Zionist hard power. From its earliest days in the late 19th century, Zionist hard power in Palestine has been constructed on 3 key pillars: technological, financial, and military supremacy through alliance with Western imperialism, militarized settlements that blur the line between civilian and soldier, and a reliance on terrorism to maintain a psychological aura of omnipotence. Technological military supremacy has been a cornerstone of Israeli military strategy and self-concept from the earlier days. And confidence in this strategy was bolstered multiple times by the defeats of large-scale conventional Arab armies at the hands of the Zionists throughout the 20th century. However, since Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance group and guerrilla army, defeated Israel in 2006, Israeli forces have refused to learn important lessons from this engagement, focusing instead on 2 primary tactics: bombing Gaza from the air and, quote, policing, end quote, the occupied and largely demilitarized Palestinian populace in the West Bank. Similarly, since the first kibbutz, the dual civilian-military purpose of settlements has been integral to Zionist military construction and social reproduction, like the border towns that dot the outskirts of native reservations across the United States and along the length of the Mexican border. Israeli kibbutzim in Palestine follow the same military logic of settler colonial expansionism. In Israel, it is a step more explicit. These settlements are not simply home to soldiers. For example, the Gaza envelope settlements of Kibbutz Biri Reim and Nahal Oz also have accompanying military bases of the same name. Finally, terrorism designed to make Palestinians abandon their land has been integral to Israeli military strategy from the bombings and massacres that defined the British Mandate era and repeated ad nauseum from Deir Yazin to Farah Kazam to the Suez Crisis to Sabra and Shatila to the Ibrahimi Mosque to Jenin to the Mavi Marmara to Al Shifa Hospital. The aim of terrorism as such is to cultivate, on one hand, a deeply rooted mindset of defeatism in the Palestinian nation, and on the other, to reproduce Israelis' own sense of supremacy. Each one of these strategic pillars was undermined by events on October 7th, have been continually proven to be ineffective, outdated, and impotent against the Palestinian and regional resistance. October 7th, a mass Hannibal event. On the morning of October 7th, fighters from Hamas' armed wing, the Qassam brigades, broke through the fence along the Gaza border. Under the cover of a barrage of several thousand rockets, the brigade headed towards the headquarters of Israel's Gaza Division and Southern Command. The goal was to attack military targets and take military captives to exchange for the thousands of Palestinian prisoners held in Zionist prisons, as well as put the question of Palestine back to the international table in a real way as more and more reactionary Arab governments turned towards normalization with Israel in recent years. The Qassam fighters found their enemy unprepared and in disarray. The headquarters of the Gaza division was seized in under an hour, and Israeli command and control broke down completely. Units that were active in the area were without orders, and no top-level command was issued for hours, much less able to make it down the chain of soldiers on the ground. This chaos reigned for hours, with Israeli units operating without coordination and essentially firing at anything that moved within the Gaza envelope, including one another. One story involved all-women armored units from the Paran Brigade roving the countryside for 16 hours without orders, reported in Israeli media as a win for feminism as these women killed, quote, over 50 terrorists, end quote. A more rational reading of this story, that several low-level soldiers, parentheses, all in their early 20s, end parentheses, were abandoned by command and left to roam the countryside, killing indiscriminately for 16 hours straight, paints a much different portrait of the capacity of the Zionist forces. But these, quote, friendly fire, end quote, instances cannot be explained just simply by the chaos that resulted in getting caught unprepared. The Hannibal Directive is a military policy that requires the use of maximum force in the event that a soldier is being kidnapped. Quote, you will open fire without constraints in order to prevent the abduction, end quote, says a former IDF soldier quoted in Al Jazeera. He added that such force is applied even at the risk of killing a captive soldier. The calculation is based on the reality that letting resistance forces take Israeli prisoners is of greater strategic damage to Israel than the death of Israelis and has been publicly known for years. What is new and shocking about October 7th is that it has been confirmed by multiple Israeli sources that Israeli command issued a mass Hannibal directive with regard to all prisoners taken, including alleged civilians. The widely circulated images of burnt-out cars from the Nova Music Festival and houses completely destroyed could only have been achieved by high-powered incendiary shells used by Israeli tanks and helicopters. Given the already described breakdown of command and control of the Israeli side, the use of Hannibal unleashed an unprecedented level of violence that killed hundreds of Israelis. The fear of letting their soldiers be captured is not irrational on the part of the Israeli military. In 2011, current Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar was released in part of the deal that saw 1,027 Palestinians freed for the return of one Israeli soldier held by Hamas, Gilad Shalit. This seemingly disproportionate exchange is an integral part of the previously ruling logic of Zionist settler colonialism, with mandatory conscription, the vast density of para-state settler militias, and within the colonial relationship more broadly, the distinction between civilian and military personnel is blurred. From this perspective, disparity in numbers seen in the Shalit deal is a core part of the psychological contract signed between the Israel and the settler population. The spirit of the Hannibal directive has continued to play out in how the Zionist forces have approached the issue of returning the prisoners currently held by the Palestinian resistance. Unable or unwilling to launch ground operations to enter the tunnels and retrieve them, Israeli forces seem content to kill their own people alongside every other person in Gaza. The reaction within Israeli society to the mass Hannibal revelations and the handling of the hostage demonstrates the degree to which these events are seen as a betrayal by the settler populace. The breakdown of the social contract is in no small part contributing to the flood of settlers leaving occupied Palestine. Ronen Bergman, a senior political analyst for the Israeli newspaper Jedioth Amronoth, was recently quoted in the Hebrew media, parentheses, translated by Al-Majidin here, and parentheses, saying, with regard to the recent meetings of the Israeli War Cabinet discussing potential responses to Iran's retaliation, quote, if they had filmed it and broadcast it on YouTube today, there would be 4 million people in Israel trying to find a way to escape from here, end quote. The Dahiya Doctrine and the Gospel. The Dahiya Doctrine gets its name from the Dahiya neighborhood in Beirut, which Israel identified as a, quote, Hezbollah stronghold, end quote, during the 2006 invasion of Lebanon. The Israelis subjected their neighborhood to scorched earth tactics that have become familiar scenes from Gaza in every Israeli offensive against Gaza since 2008. In a report by a UN fact-finding mission in the aftermath of Israel's 2008-2009 war on Gaza, Deputy Prime Minister Eli Yishai is quoted on January 6, 2009. Quote, it should be possible to destroy Gaza so they will understand not to mess with us. It is a great opportunity to demolish thousands of houses of all the territories so they will think twice before they launch rockets, end quote. This crude admission gets at the heart of the Dahiya doctrine. Strategically, it is meant to increase Israeli deterrence. In military theory, deterrence is the credible threat of force used to prevent another actor from taking hostile action. Israeli deterrence has always relied on the threat of swift, overwhelming force provided by its technological edge, whether to commit massacres during the Nakba or rout the Arab armies in 1967 and 1973. In many ways, this is not a novel strategic development of the part of Israel. Terrorism has been a cornerstone of colonial and imperialist violence for hundreds of years. The, quote, shock and awe, end quote, of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, which targeted civilians' infrastructure with mass destruction, represents another manifestation of this colonial strategy in the 21st century. Further back, a similar approach was applied by U.S. imperialists in the mass carpet bombing of Korea. It is the relentless Israeli campaign against Gaza over the last 2 decades that the Dahiya doctrine has been refined into a precise, automated killing machine. The Israeli military revealed last year that it has been developing and utilizing an AI-powered target generation system known as Hasbora, or the, quote, the gospel, end quote, in Hebrew. Hasbara codifies, automates, and expands what has been true in every previous Israeli assault on Gaza. In a report published in Plus 972 magazine, the system is described as being able to, quote, generate targets almost automatically at a rate that far exceeds what was previously possible, end quote, and as a, quote, mass assassination factory, end quote, mass assassination, end quote, here is the appropriate term. There is nothing indiscriminate about the bombings carried out daily by Zionist forces. Over half of the targets generated by Hasbara in the course of the fighting have been what are called, quote, power targets, end quote, which includes, quote, private residences, as well as public buildings, infrastructure, and high-rise blocks, end quote. These targets are discussed to cause the biggest shock possible to the social fabric of Gaza. Similar to many of the applications of the suite of technologies popularly known as, quote, artificial intelligence, end quote, this cutting-edge technology has only served to amplify and intensify the existing strategic equation of the Israeli side. The ability of Israeli forces to leverage technological and financial dominance into credible deterrence has collapsed. The threat of the Dayat Doctrine did not deter the Palestinian resistance from launching Al-Aqsa Flood last year, nor Saif al-Quds in 2021, has not deterred the Lebanese resistance from supporting Palestinians on the northern front, despite 10 years of Da'iya-style bombardment in the US-backed Saudi war on Yemen. The Yemeni resistance is undeterred. Al-Aqsa Flood, deterrence, and the battle against defeatism. Over the decades, the Palestinian struggle has seen many setbacks. The anti-imperialist struggle in the region has seen many setbacks. At a bare minimum, 5 million people from Sudan to Afghanistan have been directly killed between the invasions, dirty wars, coups, and interventions led by the United States just in the last 30 years, and the number of undoubtedly much, much higher in reality. The United States has had its forces and operatives on the ground in the region for so long that it has not had to rely on Israel as an independent actor the way it did in the mid to late 20th century. This same period was ended by the Oslo Accords, the so-called, quote, peace process, quote, end quote, and continual degradation and encroachment of Palestinian life in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The Palestinian liberation movement was fractured, divided, and lost many of its material sponsors with the collapse of the socialist camp and the anti-colonial movements. In its place rose the Comprador regime and the Palestinian Authority, and a retreat of the militant forces. There was a distinct sense of defeatism in the Palestinian National Liberation Movement and the global anti-imperialist movement. The Israelis were content, meanwhile, to continue the slow and steady process of ethnic cleansing and apartheid, self-assured in their own omnipotence and the weakness of the Palestinian movement. They did not learn any lessons from their defeat in Lebanon in 2006, instead of employing a nearly identical strategy against Gaza half a dozen times in 2 decades. October 7th and the nearly 200 days since then have revealed these suppositions about the balance of forces to be a house of cards. The resistance regionally has also demonstrated an incredibly high level of strategic patience and tactical skill. The networks that formed the basis for the axis of resistance goes back to the 1980s during the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. A new generation of organization rose up to combat this occupation, including elements that would become Hezbollah. Since their victory in 2006, Hezbollah has developed, with assistance from Iran, a complex indigenously produced missile stockpile and deep underground fortifications. Similarly, the resistance in Gaza have, even under the conditions of siege, built a similarly complex indigenous weapons production capacity and the much discussed tunnels under Gaza. This has made Israeli ground operations within Gaza over the last months catastrophic. In countless videos released by the resistance, as well as in statements from the Israeli military, it is clear that large numbers of officers have been killed by the resistance, requiring constantly calling up reservists. The tank units travel without infantry escorts, making them vulnerable to ambushes, and that ultimately the Israeli military as a fighting force on the ground cannot match the organization, leadership, bravery, and audacity of the Palestinian resistance. The resistance factions also retain a high level of popular support across Palestinian society. The unity of different political and sectarian factions on the military front has prompted discussion between the leaders of the factions in Beirut and Moscow in recent months about potential day after plans on Palestinian terms, whether a national unity government that includes all the factions, a revitalized PLO, or something else entirely. The Palestinian resistance has reignited a vision of a Palestinian future. Additionally, exemplified by the unprecedented Al-Quds Day press conference, which featured speeches from leaders across the resistance axis, and the strategic coordination of the Gaza, Lebanon, and Yemen fronts, as well as actions from Iraq and Iran, the Palestinian struggle is pulling the region closer towards cooperation and integration that potentially any time since the short and integration than potentially any time since the short-lived heyday of pan-Arabism in the 1950s and 60s, or the Arab nationalist revolts in the final days of the Ottoman Empire. What options does Israel have? Israel aimed and failed to reestablish their deterrence capacity after being humiliated by Hamas on October 7th. It is, in fact, the axis of resistance which has succeeded in establishing credible deterrence on the ground in Gaza and Lebanon, in the seas of Yemen, and with Iranian missiles and drones striking their targets within Israel. The United States is effectively deterred from further escalation and, despite Israeli bluster, it seems unlikely to pursue a regional war. Despite deploying massive violence, the strategic calculus of the Israeli military has remained stagnant and disjointed. Israeli society is riven with division and fear. The idea of image of omnipotence has been shattered. A regional war against the full force of the resistance would be disastrous for the people of the region and ultimately suicidal for the Zionist project. But there are very few power centers of individuals in Israeli politics who seem ready to admit defeat and make serious concessions at the negotiating table. Israel is backed into a corner with no good options. While this is a strategic defeat, it is also moments like this that the most unhinged and self-destructive tendencies in a society become viable. Israel, especially in this humiliated state with seemingly no way out, still remains the capacity to unleash extreme destruction, including its illegal stockpile of nuclear weapons. It is impossible to predict what will happen next, but what is abundantly clear is that the previously hegemonic logics of escalation, deterrence, and what is possible in this struggle have been upended. Yeah, free Palestine, Hezbollah, Hamas, Yemen, they're all doing their part in the axis of resistance. Yeah, they're all there because Israel created them in one way or another. The Zionist project created them. The best way to bring peace to the region is to dissolve Israel. Israel doesn't belong there. Decent Jews that live in Israel should leave Israel, is my personal opinion. If you're a decent human being, you know you don't belong there, not in the way it's being conducted. Or you should definitely rise up and protest against the system in Israel, because what is really necessary there for peace and what is best for humanity and the region is a one-state solution. As for full-blown Zionists, I think your days are not going to go well in the near future. I think this is always going to be an issue because you have a colonizer mentality, you have a fascist mentality, you have a might is right mentality, and it's grotesque, and it really exemplifies the worst of humanity, just like Hitler and the Germans and the Nazis did. Yeah, you're supposed to help your neighbors, not colonize them and take their land and have them run. Those are my basic comments on it. I'm totally in support of the Free Gaza, Free Palestine movement. And like I said again, I think what is necessary here is a one-state solution with true democratic elections at minimum. And the right to return, totally support that as well. I think any decent human being knows that what Zionists are doing is horrible and it's wrong, and it's really the worst. And I know a lot of Jews feel the same way. All right. I believe that is it for today. Yeah, let me see what. All right, that was a lot of reading for today, but that concludes our read along for today. Like I said, feel free to join if you ever have any questions to the read along. For now, I am signing off. Everybody have a great weekend, and feel free to read the description box and join along next week. Goodbye.